Welcome to another episode of Trees and Lines. Today, we chatted with Nigel Barry, the CEO of Intelfuse. Nigel has been a leader in the Australian vegetation management game for many years. Today, he's leading a Melbourne headquartered technology company focused on 3D data, allowing utilities to optimize their risk management strategies. We had a very engaging chat. Have a listen. Nigel, welcome. Nigel Barry.
Thanks. Thanks, Tej.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how to introduce you. I introduce you as a winemaker, somebody who manages a cattle farm, the CEO of Intelfuse, an Australian vegetation, expert. There's a lot. You got a lot of titles. And I know you and Phil have crossed paths in your respective kind of vegetation management journeys, as well. So. We're going to spend the next 30, 40 minutes chatting with you and talking about what you've been up to, doing some pretty interesting things, very innovative things on the software side. For our audience, Nigel Barry, again, is the CEO of Intelfuse, but also was recently accepted into NextEra's 35 Mules cohort. So congratulations on that, and is really... I guess trying to penetrate the U.S. market and basically replace all vegetation human capital.
Thanks, Tej.
Yeah.
We may as well hang up now. I think we've
lost it's over. No, Nigel. I don't even where should we start?
Well, you might start with that 35 Mules cohort because that probably means something to you two, but maybe not most of everyone else.
Yeah, we had a great dinner down in Jupiter, Florida. I don't know, Nigel, I guess, that's kind of brought you to the US really. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, thanks, Tej and Phil, for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to be here. I think we'll park the wine and the beef till later. That's sort of an after work thing, but we're very fortunate to have been invited by NextEra into their innovation hub, which is called 35 Mules. They've brought us in on the premise of supporting our development in this American market. I'm assuming they must have seen something in what we presented to them as being both interesting to NextEra, but more interesting to the rest of the world in terms of what potentially we could bring to the table. So they're big thinkers, they're supporters of innovation, and it's a pleasure to be here.
And I think it's good for our audience to kind of hear this because, there's always this perception of technology startups and companies, right? I think it's important to note that, Nigel was, one of a handful of partners, ran a very successful integrated vegetation management company in Melbourne. And basically you guys sold it, right? You sold it. And then, that kind of led you to do some more advanced work on the digital side in the space. Was that sort of summing up your journey?
Yeah, well, to be honest, Tej, my journey goes back a bit further than that, and I guess I recall I was 17 years old and looking on my parents' farm and looking out the window and seeing the smoke of a wildfire or a bushfire heading towards us, and essentially our farm was in the path of a terrible fire in 1983, one known as Ash Wednesday, and in which there was several hundred people killed, millions of stock razed, and farms destroyed, etc. And that was my first experience with wildfire. But as it turned out, it's been a lifelong journey in that space. And more importantly, after that event, the next year, I was recruited into the old state-owned electricity corporation, and went about the business of understanding how to design, manage, and operate those distribution assets. And the very first task when I went to work in it was sometime in 1984 was begin the augmentation of our network to change the way it was built to prevent the starting of bushfires. And it comes to no surprise to anybody listening who's been in the space that the single largest outage cause on distribution networks is actually vegetation. And most people would have heard the phrase, trees and power lines don't mix. And in Australia and on the west coast of the the US now, they don't mix for a very good reason, because they can cause a spark and hence a fire. So that was the beginning of my introduction to utility networks, wildfire, vegetation, etc. Over the next 10 years, I was in that utility, worked through a range of roles, and the final role was I was acting in the position of the bushfire mitigation manager, which in simple terms is developing the corporate policy and outworking that policy to protect the authority's insurance policy with respect to those fires. So had a great introduction to the world of bushfire mitigation, of which the vegetation program was a very significant part, as it is in most utilities. So whether you talk about bushfire mitigation or you talk about veg management, in the end it's an emotional word that we use to focus people's energy and effort into that part of that segment of the operations. 1995 brought about great change in our country, and we went down the path of privatisation. It was during that time that I escaped. I say escaped loosely, but that's what it felt like. And was able to set up our own business with 2 partners, and we built that business over 20 years. But the main function was actually outsourcing the vegetation management role. So taking the management from inside the utility, taking it out, and then focusing it back with a single focus on driving efficiencies and change in that space. So yeah, I've got a long history there. You're right, we did sell that after 20 odd years, but kept this little particular piece of technology, the LIDAR based technology that's called Intelfuse. And in my mind, that's a distillation of some 30 odd years of work trying to take that into the digital world and optimize all the learnings we have, because we have very deep domain knowledge, and as Phil will attest in his work life, that domain knowledge is really the essence of life in a way. It's all pervasive, and if you can help people with that historical knowledge of experience, then I think we've got potential to change what goes on. The challenge, of course, has been, how do you digitize that? We've seen LIDAR come into play. We've seen, mobile mapping. We're now seeing satellites, which are all very interesting. But I think, it's none of them. Most of the things I've seen do not actually go end to end. They don't actually replace enough of the program to make the business case stack up very well. So we've been focused on driving that end-to-end process, removing as many boots from the ground as we can, in order to let the automation take its place, and use the skilled arborists, foresters for very specific purposes to do the work that they're actually trained for, not to actually walk and count trees and do mundane tasks. So, that's our objective, and that's the one we're working towards, and in some respects succeeding quite well. In others, there's still a way to go.
Yeah, I guess, and Nigel, we're obviously going to have a very honest discussion about it. And I feel like the idea, the vision, what you're packaging is actually brilliant and extremely thoughtful. And the one thing that, at least in my experience, I've seen is really the challenge becomes the adoption, right? Replacing the boots is like replacing, in some essence, an aspect of the buyer, which can be very scary. Like this level of disruption, change, which it truly is. Talk a little bit about that challenge, right? You're introducing something to the market that could be game changing, and it could also scare the shit out of the market. So how do you sort of solve for that? How are you solving for that?
Well, it's an excellent question. And, I think every client is different, and it's classic selling, if you like. You really need to do that discovery of where each customer is. And, transformation is hard. It's difficult. And when you're in a space like this where people are very focused, they're committed individuals, and you're wanting to introduce something that challenges, number one, their roles and their friends' roles, it's difficult. And I think the best way to start, it's really in support of what they're doing. It's giving them better information. And I think one of the great challenges of vegetation management, and I think it's a black art. And I call it a black art because fundamentally no one ever knows what they've got to do. And that if you think about life, you wouldn't go and you wouldn't build a house or a shed without having dimensions. You couldn't pour the slab of concrete if you didn't know how thick you wanted or how many square feet in your language you wanted. You wouldn't just go to the concrete and say, give me a price to pour a slab. He'd look at you strangely. But in many senses, that's what we do in our industry. We say, we want to maintain this clearance through this geography. Now, I think you open yourself up to many things. And, historically, we have been able to get a price on the table. We think we're using market forces to derive the best price. I'd put it forward that if you had better information, you could get better outcomes in terms of execution and ultimately price and ultimately a risk reduction. So what we are trying to do is be very granular in that data to allow better and deeper analysis from a risk and cost point of view, and therefore ultimately an execution point of view.
When you say utilities don't know what they're doing or what's out there, talk to me a little bit about that, because they probably don't have it quantified the way you do.
That's correct.
But I would guess most utilities do have metrics on what they're about to undertake.
Sure. What metrics are you thinking there, Phil?
Well, the basic thing from the past was, number of trees that they have to maintain that are within their tolerance limits, or acres, or anything else. And they usually gather that for a more timely inventory from the boots on the ground.
Yeah. Fair point. Point's well taken. I guess what I'm more interested in is the complete inventory, not just the trees that are there for today. I'm interested in the trees for tomorrow, next year, next 3 years, next 5 years. The trees that and how they're interacting with every other tree, because it's once you go through a span and you make a cut, it's done. I'm interested in what's left behind and how that's going to change in time and over what time. So I would contend that whilst utilities think they know what they've got, I don't believe they know what they really have.
Yeah, I understand. It depends on if we're talking about this year or we're talking about the next 10 years or over the course of the cycle or whatever the scheduling period is.
Well, let's have a chat about that, because I think it's a very valid point. But if you once you send your men out, if you send 10 men out or women out, I would contend that you'll get 7 different answers. And that in itself suggests that we've got a risk to our strategy and our plan. So trying to get a singular truth of data based on the business rules of the utility and then using that in our planning and our execution is where we're trying to drive to. So having more granular, deeper, better data to do a better analysis, apply risk equations, cost equations, and come up with, essentially, and whilst this is not practical, but essentially which tree to cut first in order to, have a better grip on risk.
For, the viewing audience here, Nigel, so that people understand essentially what you're doing. In order for your secret sauce and your IP to work, the basic input would have to be LIDAR data, right? You need data to then map out some type of 3D image of the entire system where you can then measure point to point, the appropriate clearances, etc. You have a good snapshot understanding of what the system looks like visually. Is that correct? Am I saying this right?
We certainly use LIDAR as our base case. We've found LIDAR to be the most accurate source of data. And but we can also use satellite. But the truth of it is the accuracy is not at the level that we need, but the LIDAR is. And the cost of LIDAR collection is coming down, by the day. I'm sure once we get beyond visual line of sight drones in the air, it's going to be very tough to beat the accuracy. We in utilities love accuracy. We're engineers. That's what drives us. So at the end of the day, if you're in a wildfire in a risk situation and you've got an insurance policy that says you must maintain a certain clearance, you're not going to trust an inaccurate data set.
I guess in order for your software to do what it's doing at the level that you want it to do it at, it's a function of the quality of the data capture, the accuracy of the data capture. And so in your opinion right now, where do we sit in terms of that? Like the input that's coming in, where do you think that is in terms of the quality, right? Are we 70% of the way there? Are we 60% of the way there?
From a LIDAR perspective?
Mm-hmm.
I'd say we're much better than that. Yes,
Okay.
I think LIDAR's come a long way. It's much simpler in its in the way it's collected. Clearly, you need to have a specification, and that doesn't need to be complex. It just needs to meet certain criteria. I think what's important moving into the distribution world, which is of course where the majority of risk is left these days, is it needs to be cost competitive. So whilst LiDAR cameras are getting better and better and you can get, literally hundreds of points per square meter, it may or may not be cost effective to use that data. So what we've found is we can certainly get away with a lot less. And so in trying to get the right cost mix, we've focused on getting, the minimum data we need in order to achieve the objectives that we have.
The volume of data is just amazing. What's available to work with.
Yeah, too true, Phil. And as you well know, you can overlay those various layers of information to enhance the outputs. So we've taken a slightly different approach, and the LiDAR is a huge data set, as you say. We've taken the approach of building a 3D model of every single stem. Pulled out the conductors, pulled out the poles, the ground, and the man-made objects. And because it's all modeled, we can then automatically script all the compliance measurements required for the utility and set up clearance zones. Every utility has a different sort of clearance zone for different reasons. And so to be able to ingest that business rule into the system is critical, and then publish it out in the form that they need it. And I think this is a really key thing, to get the data in a form. I know in the US it's called actionable insights, but in my view it's just data that the man on the ground can understand and use. It's very simple. That's the holy grail.
Defining the clearance or the tolerance limits, that has to be a key to what drives your decisions. And I understand it on transmission, because those are defined by regulation. Here in the States, I don't know about Australia. In California and a lot of the West, there may be clearance that's regulated on distribution. But for the vast majority of our country, the relationship between tree and the line isn't quite as well defined. So are you running into that, and how are you handling that?
That's a great question, because my world is quite rigid. And in some cases, we have legislated clearance, which that's phenomenal. The rest is regulated. And you're right, the west coast of the US is not dissimilar to the Australian style. I think we're in our case, we're required to keep trees outside of a zone. In many places in the US, you're required to cut the trees to outside the zone. So two different scenarios. I think what we've seen with the people we've talked to, they have really liked the idea that they can challenge their regime and understand the cost of changing the clearance zone. Because I would contend with the LiDAR outputs that you don't need to persist with a one-size-fits-all. I think if you can understand your risk profile through the environment or via customers or whatever drives your risk profile, then you can apply a different clearance regime to those different areas. And furthermore, Phil, you'd well understand the Australian situation. We're required to take into account sag and sway, which is a necessary phenomenon for the transmission networks, but that's on our distribution networks. Sag and sway drives a lot of those cutting decisions. So this idea that we can now bring the level of risk down to a level of granularity at tree level or span level or wherever you want it, I think is a very important concept going forward, because having a digital line of sight of what is actually there and why you made certain decisions is going to be critical when you're backed into a corner by, in my language, a coroner's court or up against the insurers. So having this knowledge of why certain decisions were made against what business rule, and having a single truth of data, I think becomes a critical path for the future.
So you brought up something I wanted to kind of touch on, maybe specifically away from the technology and more about the culture, right? You know, you live in Melbourne, I believe, right? Melbourne. And, you know, I believe that Intelfuse has partnered with a couple of Australian-based utilities. That's what you guys have been sort of running your trials through. You know, your knowledge of the U.S. market and other sort of geographies, you know, talk a little bit about the difference in culture of how business gets done, how regulatory bodies differ. You know, you mentioned some very technical, unique differences, but what about from a cultural perspective? Like, you know, how different is it, you know, trying to penetrate the U.S. market versus, you know, operating within the Australian one?
I think in many ways they're similar. However, you know, relationships always go a long way.
Sure.
Credibility is you know, it needs to be built in time, and with credibility comes the opportunity to work with people and develop you know, concepts with them. So I've never had the good fortune of being able to walk in the door and come out with a contract. I've never seen that happen. I would love it to happen. It's always years of work. You've got to build rapport. You've got to build a level of trust and prove your capability.
Yeah.
So in that respect, I don't think they're different. The differences are, it is much harder probably for an Australian utility not to do work. So just because there's a budget crunch doesn't mean that they can stop cutting trees, especially in this new climate-affected world. I mean, it'd be fair to say in Australia now, areas that had not ever experienced a wildfire 2 years ago or 3 years ago had the worst in memory, and those areas were you know, you would have called quite temperate and even subtropical, but they literally perished. So things are always on review, and I suspect the US will face similar climate challenges. So, you know, regulators will adopt and change as they see the need to, you know, to protect the constituency.
I mean, I know Phil has a lot of opinions on this. When he was building his consultancy, you know, decade and a half ago, and was operating in international markets, like it's, and at least in the U.S., as you move from state to state, as you move from west to east, north to south, the subcultures are so different, right? The approach, the strategies, the risks, the regulatory requirements, what the PUC is doing here versus what they're doing over here, and so these subcultures, you know, they what I've observed in my very limited lens. I'm sitting with the Mount Rushmore of vegetation experts over here, but what I have observed though is there's a dislocation, a very disconnected sort of thing. There's no the standardization of process approach, like you said, Nigel. Like you can send a group of people out there and get quite a varied data set of opinions, but I also feel that you get a very data set of leadership, a very data set of approach, and it becomes very hard to commoditize these type of processes. You know, there's no standardization of education, and I know Phil works very diligently with, you know, industry groups to try to bring that standardization to a level where we can start to, you know, have good idea sharing and good exchange of process. But I don't know if we're there yet.
I was recently working on a case with 5 expert witnesses looking at one tree, and like you said, Nigel, 5 answers. So yeah, will be a while.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's the same in this country, but you know, in Australia, there's 7 states or something.
Yeah,
you think I would know, but you know, when we had our own cutting resource there, we could not bring a man from one state to the other and start work. He had to have a different training regime, and when you think about that, you say, what are we doing to ourselves? I can only imagine what it must be like here.
It's complex.
As you move from a more regulated environment, which I would assume California is, to as you come further east into the Midwest, I'm sure there are different standards and requirements.
Yep.
Just simply because of what drives the OH&S rules, and probably also unionized workforces and different things. So, look, training. You cannot do enough if you want to build that OH&S culture into what's a very dangerous industry. And if you think about it, I always say to people, you're sending relatively unskilled men into the air in a bucket truck, near live power lines, with a chainsaw, on a road reserve. What more do you want?
Yeah. Oh, it's
pretty
wild.
And then you've got to know how to cut the tree as well. So we've got a very complex and challenging industry. And so investment in training at all levels is absolutely critical if we're going to make improvements in the ultimate outcome. To date, we've talked really about how do we get to a point where we can execute, not necessarily how we execute the work, which is, there is a separation there and a whole different game.
I think when we met for dinner, Nigel, I think you mentioned it's an 8-person team, including yourself. You've got some developers, you've got some vegetation expertise. So, if somebody just dropped, $100 million, in your lap tomorrow, what are you using that money for? Like, is the software as it stands today completely functional and can handle anything? Or what is the dollars of capital used for you? Like, what does it do to your product? What does it do to your service?
Well, that's an interesting question. We can easily cope with any transmission project anywhere in the world. The challenge with distribution, of course, is somewhat different. We're still building out and scaling up our capacity to do literally hundreds of thousands of poles per month, and that if you look at networks in the US, many networks are fully encompassed and surrounded by trees. So the ability of algorithms to extract a pole out of a forest, so to speak, or an urban forest, is quite complex. So there's a whole range of automation work that's still to be completed there, and we've got a way to go. But our tree segmentation is really fantastic. But there are workarounds to achieving that. But the major investment would be in scaling up, because I'm not necessarily measuring a business value. To me, is not necessarily about the number of employees you have. It's actually, in this case, it's about how we can push data through the system out the other side so it's usable in the fastest possible manner. And so that's, if I was fortunate enough to have access to some of that capital, that's where I'd push it. Just drive those algorithms harder, push it through quicker on a larger scale.
Basically more development costs, right? More software development, right? Processing engines.
Yeah, I mean, it's very targeted development cost. If you think about it, really there's half a dozen essential algorithms, so it's improving the automation around that pole extraction, the conductor extraction. That's really, the rest actually works very well. But when you get to scale, you need to obviously harden the databases and make sure that it's stable.
So you're pushing the data, you're not acquiring it. Are you usually dependent on third-party acquisition?
Yeah, good question.
We are, Phil. We're happy to work with the client to subcontract that work, but I've focused on this middleware type proposition, whereby we're seeing a lot of utilities now investing in their own LIDAR systems. There are many other people moving into the market, whether it be drones or helicopters or fixed wing, even Geiger mode LIDAR covering large swaths of the country at once. They're experts at that. All we need to do is write a spec and then push it in, or pull it in, however people want.
Are you going to predict the future? Are we going to see more and more drone, or more and more satellite, or where are we headed?
I think we're definitely going to see drones when they can go beyond visual line of sight. That's really going to be a cost driver. I mean, I look at the drone situation now and I think they're funky and really cool. But when you can only fly, 1 or so miles before you have to move and reset up, it doesn't lend itself to wide scale production, Phil. And you would know that. You've got that a man could have done 5 times what was done by the drone in that time. So it's probably not going to be sustainable. I think there's going to be people closing out work by using drones as audit tools, etc., etc. But frankly, I see that moving into augmented reality, closing out work. So that's a topic for another day, and perhaps not as public as this. But there are I see a lot of that being done prior to the workforce moving from the site. I believe that satellite will have a major role to play as the accuracy increases, as we'll be able to derive LIDAR from space. Man, why wouldn't you want to do it? But I think the model will change. I think it will become a data on demand model, not this. Yeah, I think that people struggle with flying the whole network. And whilst at one level it's fantastic to have the complete data set and analyze the whole network, it's almost not practical. And the level of risk potential that it brings to the table, almost unmanageable in some cases. So I think staged approaches and data on demand are going to be much more in play as we progress forward.
Nigel, you have such a good international lens, right? With what's happening in Australia, do you think Australia is ahead or behind the US in traditional vegetation practices, technology, both hardware and software? Like, where does that part of the world sit? And do you think there are other parts in Europe that are ahead or behind? Like, who's leading us globally in this space?
Best practice is driven by local requirement. What works in one place doesn't necessarily work in another.
No, that's fair. That's fair.
So I think we're all trying to solve our own problems. But what we can do is interact better and learn more from the other side of the fence. Share better information, be collaborative in those sort of things, because there are learnings from both sides. I look at the IVM strategy here in the US and think, wow, that's pretty neat. That's clever. Do we do it in Australia? Not in the same way or same language, not with the same passion. Do we manage risk differently in Australia? Absolutely. Why? Because we've been forced to. So, what's right, what's wrong? I think the great challenge is when you have incidents, there's a natural reaction to spend money rather than take a breath.
Yeah, the whole idea of matching resources to the real risk, and just that's where we need to constantly be moving.
Hate to say it, Phil, but it goes to my point of actually knowing what you have.
Yep.
And where it is.
I understand.
And when you have that, that's when you can start to ask very different questions. And when you get those answers, you can ask even more questions. And sometimes it's not obvious.
No, and sometimes it gets complicated. The relationship between a tree or proximity to the conductor and the importance of that in the concept or context of fire is one thing. In the context of reliability, it's another. So, and I imagine there's other things that are driving utilities. So it is interesting how you interpret that and how they'll make decisions in the future.
I think it's a great point, because if you look at a risk matrix of all this, there are all those items you mentioned. Then there's the supplier reliability and customer issues and environmental issues that can also and should be overlaid on all that. And so when you're able to know what you have and then apply those layers and lenses to it, you can then begin to filter in a very different way and get very specific as to where the risk is. And I personally would much rather be in the court with that level of data and explaining why we did it this way and why we cut that tree and not this one than the other. Because there's so, as we all know, I said before, it's a black art, and that's because there's so much subjectivity. Now, of course, this data that we have is not perfect, but what you can say is the reasons that, based on a set of business rules articulated by the utility, we're able to make this decision when ranking this risk against that risk. And I think that, to me, is a start of a new way of doing business and thinking. At the moment, unfortunately, we've got the 10 men out there and the 7 answers. No one's right, no one's wrong. It's subjective. But that's really difficult to support.
All kinds of decisions. Do you take a tree that's 100% likely to cause one person to be out of service? Or a tree that's 30% likely to take 1,000 people out? What's the driver? It really opens up so many possibilities on how you can assess risk.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
It is.
How good to have that data to be able to ask and test the assumptions around that.
So right now, Nigel, in your life cycle of bringing this to market, describe some of the challenges. Like, what are you running up against? Is it people don't buy it? Is it adoption? Is it cost? Is it you're too far ahead? Like, where are you right now?
That's also a interesting question, and one I reflect on almost daily. I can safely say that everybody that we've shown the software and the outputs to have said, this is amazing. In some cases you hear, this is the missing link, and so on. The challenge, of course, is, and I hadn't probably realized this enough, but the challenge is, in order for those people who technically understand it to move it forward, there's a number of layers of hierarchy to move through. Secondly, it's difficult because when you have this data, you have the opportunity to transform so many things. You challenge your contracting model, which we all know has a life cycle. So you can't race in and, throw that lump sum contract out, or that mile contract out, or that hourly rate contract out and convert to whatever you want to do. It takes time. Furthermore, you've got embedded resource that's used to doing things in a certain way. You can't change them overnight. So it becomes a change management process. But what I do believe is that if you're able to work in a collaborative partnering way with people, you can step your way through proof of concepts, through trials, through larger geographical areas, and test these things before you go the big bang. I think the most dangerous thing is big bang here, because nobody will trust. There won't be enough trust in the process. So they're sort of the reflections I've been having, Tej, as to the ways forward. But it all comes down to people and trust and collaboration, I believe. And the most important thing, how do the people in the field take your data and execute? If they can't do that as if it was yesterday with the old data, it will almost inevitably fail.
I was going to comment on that, because though you may be solving for the 7 different opinions, the tool, and I see what you're developing as this very well-designed tool, it still requires good data. It still requires an element of good human interaction, good execution. So there's still that balance of technology meets good decision making. So it'll be interesting to see how you can demonstrate that process to your buying market.
Well, I think let's just walk that back a bit,
Sure.
Tej. I wouldn't disagree, but I'll put this as an alternative. Sure. I spent 20 years trying to outsource the management function from utilities. And, and Phil probably did the same thing, but maybe in a slightly different way. And one of the things that in doing that, one of the things we did, we actually took skills away from the utility. And so what you have now is, in some ways, a loss of knowledge about how how the contracting market works, how the tree business works.
You mean inside the utility?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
And so what I think we're enabling here is them to take more control of their program. So for them to specify explicitly what they want done to a tree, rather than how a span or a mile should look. Now, this is a fundamental difference, and it's what Phil's, former resource would do. They'd walk the field and they'd say, we want this tree removed or this tree trimmed and so on. But once again, you had the 10 with 7 answers type scenario. Now, I'm not saying that's how it was really, but, that's in general the subjective nature of what we do. But if if people trust the data, and we've seen now over several iterations of rolling contracts that they don't even look at the 3D visualization now, it's just give the data out. But the most important thing here is we take back control of what gets done.
Okay.
Because in a tree game, if you're the client, if you don't spend money, if you don't cut a tree, you don't spend money. But what if you should have cut that tree? Then you're likely to spend a lot of money down the track. So it's knowing which tree to cut and when, and why not to or why to. Those things can be subjective, but by hardening this up, we get to, I think, a much better place in terms of data integrity, and therefore being able to control the program going forward.
Make the cuts that have the impact.
Phil, you just gave Nigel a tagline. I love it.
No, but in all seriousness, you're exactly right. The different contract models drive different behaviours. We need to have the behaviours that actually achieve the objectives of the utility in the most efficient, least risk way.
I love software. I love the digital age. I'm a sucker for it in all aspects of my life. And I think the industry and the sector in particular is ripe for it, is curious about it. The risk profile is so front and center now in every state, in most countries, whether it's a climate conversation or environmental conversation. This is all happening very real time. I always get concerned about adoption and timing of when things are early, or, I think you're on the right track. I really do. I think you've developed something very thoughtful and sleek, and it represents kind of your life's body of work integrated into the digital age. So, as we continue to develop a relationship, and a friendship, and drink your fantastic Chardonnay, which I can't wait to do, I really, look forward to, kind of watching your journey in this process, because I do think you've developed something that, warrants a lot of attention. But I do think you're going to face some hurdles that, some that of already, and some that are going to punch you in the face and you're not expecting. But I do think that you're on the right track and right journey. So I'm very excited to kind of see your progress and monitor it.
I'm envious, Nigel. I spent a lot of my career where the industry was without data, just didn't have it. And then I think of what you're working with now, and it's just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, well, thanks, Phil and Tej. Look, be more than happy to share and collaborate with you both, because I think, we all ride on the shoulders of people who have gone before us and taught us. I had many mentors, and to be allowed to have those experiences over all these years in different parts of the country and different parts of the world, to learn from those people, that's the part of it, that's the impetus and what's been distilled into the way we think. And whilst we have a software, it's actually informed by our experiences. It's not a technology pushed down. It's our experiences informing how the technology needs to deliver information for us as people at the coalface. And I think that's a really critical point of what we've tried to do, and why we find when the adoption is finally there, there's a thirst for even pushing it even further, because the data makes sense. It's in a format, it's in a language that everybody's used to. And I think that's a critical thing with software, that it actually it needs to have the DNA of the industry in it. And I'm hoping that's what we've actually done.
Hearing your background, you and Phil actually, for a period of your careers, shared a very similar background, both in the private sector and then, of course, where you started at the utility. And I think that clearly seems like it's being integrated into your solution. Like, you're joining another Aussie who's disrupting the world right now. You're trying to take on vegetation management, and Greg Norman's taking on the PGA with his live golf. So you're in good company with global disruption.
Well, yes, I think one thing there, he's got the money, I haven't.
Yeah,
I was going to say
I think he's got some wine too. So, Phil, I don't know if you have any final thoughts, but
no, I really appreciate it, Nigel. This was very good.
Nigel, this was fantastic. Like I said, I look forward to continued dialogue with you offline, and really kind of learning more about the software, the technology, and kind of seeing kind of your progress within the U.S. But thank you so much for joining us, taking the time. It just was a great conversation. Really enjoyed chatting with you.
Thanks, Nigel.
Thank you, Phil. And thanks, Tej. It's been my pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Trees and Lines, brought to you by Iapetus Holdings. If you like the show, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. If you have any questions or comments on any of our episodes or ideas for topics or guests, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact us at treesandlines@iapetusllc.com. We'll chat with you soon.